Hello, everybody. Whenever you're listening to this, whether that be morning, afternoon, or evening, or 2 in the morning, this is the first of the Wolfville Ridge Bible Study series Wolfville Ridge Baptist, Bible Study series on Esther. We're going to be taking a stroll through the book of Esther. It's one of my favorite books. There's a lot of very interesting things in there. Um, as always, I prefer to do this in person, but thankfully technology makes it so that we can meet up even when we're not able to. Um, you'll have to forgive my surroundings. I'm in my apartment right now. I have it's over on the side, a paintball gun hung up right here because I used to play paintball all the time as a kid, and I still do every now and then. And my cat might pop up here on the couch behind me once or twice, but such is the nature of recording everything online. So let's jump right into it. So the book of Esther. We're gonna look at how this is going to work. I'm gonna follow my dad's model, at least for now. And in that, what I mean is, when we're meeting in person, we'll start with probably about 10-15 minutes of prayer as like a little prayer meeting as the preamble to it. And then we'll keep going throughout the Bible study. Now, the way my dad runs his Bible studies is that at the very beginning, when we're looking at the passage, he'll get everybody to, so for example, first person's over here, they read one verse, and then the next person reads a verse, the next person reads a verse, and we all read until we get to the end of the book. Or not the end of the book, that would take forever, until we get to the end of the chapter. And then from there, we'll go into the discussion of the what we had just read. And I'll have prepared slides, some questions. If this goes anything at all like my dad's Bible studies, I fully expect us to take more than a couple weeks to get through this book. This book brings up some pretty interesting questions about God and all of that. And if you ever have any questions after listening to this, where it's posted on Facebook and YouTube, you can post a question as your comment there, and I'll try and get back to it in the next week's Bible study. I love it when people go off the rails a little bit and ask questions that lead down rabbit trails, because that's really where the most important material is held, and that's where sometimes the most important information is as well, at least when we're looking at the Bible. So like I said, we're online for right now. I prefer that not to be. And I'll give you a little bit of a warning in saying that weeks that are online are probably going to be shorter than in person. This is specifically because, like I said, the discussion element in Bible studies is really quite important for me. And I think it's important for all of us. So like I said, it'll be a little bit longer in person. And in these Bible studies, discussion is key. That's the most important thing. So we're actually going to start chapter 1 of Esther next week. This week is going to be a little bit of a preamble. We're going to be talking a little bit about how the book came to be and the important things that we should be keeping an eye out for as we start to look through the book of Esther together. So let's open up with a pretty important question, I think. Why do we have the Old Testament anyway? This is a question that gets asked all the time. They say, well, Jesus came and the law, we don't have to follow that in the Old Testament anymore. So why do we even keep it around? Why don't we just have the New Testament? There's a lot of reasons why we have the Old Testament. And this isn't just coming from me being a student at the Divinity College, but the Old Testament is almost as critically important as the New Testament is for us as Christians. So my first point to this would be, in order to know the Christ story, we also need to know what came before. If you look at our Christmas services, for example, a lot of times the scriptures that we quote are from the Old Testament when talking about prophecy for Christ. So it's really important to know the context, and it's really important to know what came before Christ in order to know Christ. For example, a big part of Christ's life and ministry was the fact that he was Jewish. So we have to make sure that we understand Jewish culture so that we can better understand Jesus, because ultimately we want to know him better. In knowing the Old Testament better, we get to know Jesus better because we can understand more and have a deeper understanding of his times, really. So like I said, it puts everything in context. For example, Jesus was Jewish, and this was very important. We also have to look at the nature of God and how he works with us. A good deal of it comes from the Old Testament. When we're looking at a lot of the promises that we'll just list off the top of our head that God gives us, a lot of them come from the Old Testament. Some from the prophets, some from the Psalms, and of course we do get some from the New Testament as well. But the Old Testament has a very deep and rich history to it. And especially when we're looking at the nature of God and how we as Christians know God to work, if we got rid of the Old Testament, we'd be getting rid of 70% of what we know of how God works with us. It's really important to know all of the different things that God does for us. And in that, it's another element as to why the Old Testament is important. So, for example, you get things like the burning bush, or how God worked with Israel. Like, even though they kept straying away from him, he always brought them back again. Like, these really critically important things we wouldn't have unless we had the Old Testament. So if we want to know as much as possible about God, we need both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Of course, with the New Testament, we can read the Old Testament in a slightly different light. The Old Testament becomes fuller with the knowledge of Jesus that comes through the New Testament. But if we only have the New Testament, it's not quite as full unless we have the Old Testament. They work in synchro. They work together. I'll try not to use fancy words because I'll just stumble at the pronunciation. So let's look at the origins of the book of Esther. Esther is one of the important books of the Old Testament for a couple of different reasons. So to begin with, it's the last of the 5 scrolls found in the 3rd section of the Old Testament, dubbed the writings. So you get the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, and that forms the basis for the Jewish Bible. And then we get the law books, like oh, that's horrible. I can't remember. Let me grab my Bible out, because apparently I can't remember some of these things right off the top of my head. Now I know why Dad still doesn't have the Lord's Prayer memorized, even though he's been preaching it for countless years. So the first 5 books, of course, are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They're pretty important books. Those are the Pentateuch. And then when we get towards Esther, Nehemiah, and Ezra are 3 books that are kind of intertwined with each other. And Ezra is the last of these 5 scrolls section in the Old Testament, dubbed the writings. It's where we get the origin for the Festival of Lots, which is an important Jewish festival. And the author is unknown, though people have speculated that it might have been Ezra, who was one of the previous authors from the previous scrolls. He was the one who went with the Persian envoy from Persia to Jerusalem to help start the rebuilding of the Jewish culture right before Nehemiah comes in to rebuild the walls. And of course, Mordecai is also another speculative author. And if you don't know who he is, you're going to figure that out pretty quick, because he's a pretty important component to the story. So when does the book of Esther take place? This is a pretty important part of how we look at Esther. Thankfully, as I'll bring up here in a second, Esther tends to be one of the few books that we can accurately date due to its contents. The Persians, thankfully, were really big into astronomy and stuff like that, which means that a lot of their events were recorded, to which then we can put actual dates upon it. So, for example, we know when, like, the year that Esther saves the Jews from massacre. Spoiler alert, I guess, if you haven't read the book yet. But so let's take a look at some of the various datings here. The Jews returned from exile in Babylon in 536 BC, and the temple is rebuilt between 536 and 516, and this is detailed in the book of Ezra, the temple being rebuilt. That's the big part of that. Esther then becomes the queen of Persia around 478 BC. Now, we have to be observant here. What happened to Babylon? Babylon and Persia aren't the same place, and Esther becomes the queen of Persia. So how did this work? So between the Jews returning from exile in 536 and Esther becoming the queen of Persia in 478, Babylon was taken over by the Persians. And basically, there was a new sheriff in town, there's a new king in town. The Babylon Empire was kind of becoming decrepit and it fell apart. And then the Persians came in and became the next big empire in the area. Esther then saves the Jews from massacre in 473 BC, which again is a pretty important part. Spoiler alert if you haven't read the book yet. And then Ezra goes from Babylon to Jerusalem in 457, and finally Nehemiah rebuilds the wall in 444 BC. Now, we have to look at this we have to put on our thinking caps a little bit. Esther becomes the queen of Persia in this time, which means she has a decent amount of power, or at least leaning upon the king's ear a little bit, and can help some of the events take place that need to take place. We'll get into this a little bit. So what's important about this book? There's a lot that's important about this book. It's important from a theological perspective, looking at how God works with us, which is a pretty interesting thing about the book that we'll look at in a couple slides. It's also important from a historical point of view. Esther is a book that, well, without Esther, we wouldn't really have modern day Christianity, or we probably wouldn't. It's really interesting to see how God works through Esther to make sure that Jesus comes in the New Testament. So without Esther, Jerusalem would likely have never been rebuilt, something that we can only take from the history of the book. Esther would probably, from some of the concordances that I've read, have probably had a big deciding factor in what aided Ezra and Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem and help the rebuilding. Without that, Jerusalem would likely have never been rebuilt. And this is something that the book never explicitly says, but because we can look at the history of the book, we can make the educated guess and say, well, she was the queen at the time. God must have put her in that position not only to save the Jews from massacre, but also to help these future events that would allow Jerusalem to be rebuilt and allow the Israelites to become, a nation after the exile, which is, again, something that's not ever specifically said in the book, but we can infer it from its history. Without Esther, it's likely that none of us could have been saved. Without Israel becoming a state again, or a power, Jesus wouldn't have been born in Israel. Well, that's all speculation. We can't actually say what would have happened if Esther was never queen, because, well, this is where we live. We do know that she was the queen, and she helped rebuild Jerusalem, which was critically important. So it's really interesting to see how God worked through her, not only for the elements in the book that we'll look at in a couple weeks, but also through the parts that we only know because that we can date the book in the specific events. Talk about right place, right time, which brings us to a pretty interesting. So there's some pretty strange things about the book of Esther, and not in a negative way, but there's one specific thing that has caused some people to question it a little bit. And if you have done some reading previous to listening to this Bible study, and if your Bible has a little preamble at the beginning of the book about some of the, basic stuff about the book, you've probably noticed one interesting detail. That is, the word God, or the Jewish word for God being Yahweh, never appears in this book. This is a fairly curious thing. In a book all about God, which is the Bible, there's a book within it that never actually mentions God, ever. Um, of course, as a little bit of an aside, what I have written there on the side is YHWH is the Jewish word for Yahweh, or Yahweh, if I'm getting my pronunciation right. And the Hebrew language is well known for not having any vowels in it at all, which makes translating to English quite interesting, to say the least. But to go back to this weird thing at hand, God never appears in this book. So how do we as Christians deal with this? This is something that a lot of people have questioned about the book. You know, where is God? The careful thing that we have to do, though, is that we can realize that God is never explicitly said about or talked about in the book. But we have to be very careful to realize that God is ever present implicitly in the book. That means God is always there in the background working, but he's never actually referred to. And it's pretty clear to see that, especially in relation to the things that we just talked about, with Esther being there not only for the events of this book, but also to help the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So how did it end up in the canon? Well, it's a pretty important book of Jewish history. This is the story of how the Jews were saved, essentially, from massacre in Persia, equivalent to roughly the Holocaust. This would have been devastating for the Jewish population. There would have been some Jews in Jerusalem as they were starting to rebuild some things, but the population would have been quite weak, and getting rid of all of the Jews in Persia would have obliterated them. So this is an important story on this aspect, but it's also an important story of how God works through us, through circumstance. Now, this is something, actually, I preach about it a little bit in my sermon coming up tomorrow for you guys. I'm recording this on Friday. How God works through different people through different ways. Me personally, I've never received a dream or vision or words from God directly, but he's always worked with me through gut feeling or through coincidence, like, being at the Ridge for 4 years before I decided to do my master's seems like a bit of a coincidence, because now I'm in the position to be able to help you guys through this period of Bob's retirement, and also it helps me as a growing pastor. The book of Esther is very much in line with that. God is never explicitly mentioned in Esther, but he's always implicitly mentioned. He works through Esther in a way that he doesn't work through everybody, which is one of the important reasons why it's in the Bible. How is this different from any other story? Some secular agnostic or atheist might say, well, if Esther's in the Bible and it never mentions God at all, then you could have a story about a boy and his dog and have it put in the Bible and say, well, it never mentions God, but it's a story, so it must belong there. That's not true, if you can't take my sarcasm. Esther is critically important when talking about how the Jews were saved through God, but also how God works through us. Again, God is never explicitly mentioned. That means God is never written on the page in the book of Esther, but he's underneath the page. He's there working through it, if that makes any sense. So why is this important for us as Christians in 2022? This is quick math, 2,500-ish years ago-ish. So as mentioned, the Old Testament puts a lot of things into context for us. when we're going to look through the book of Esther, we're going to see a pretty critically important part of Jewish history. We're going to see the establishment of the Festival of Lots. We're going to see the Jews coming back to, well, we're going to see the enabling of the Jews coming back to Jerusalem. We're also going to see some pretty important things, and pretty important themes, rather, and ideas presented by the book, which are critically important for us. How God can work through us as a people, or us as individuals as well. Esther had a lot to contend with by keeping her Jewish identity a secret. She also had a lot to deal with by the fact that she was a woman in these times, and also in Persian culture, you know, things got even more complicated. But it's important to look at how God can work through us, and also how we can trust God. Again, God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, but it's so important that we realize how Esther is trusting in God in all of this. Without this story, there would be no Christianity. Now, I'm not saying if Esther were removed from the Bible, there wouldn't be Christianity. I'm saying that Esther is critically important from a historical perspective, looking at how the Israelites, or the Jews, came to be a nation again after the exile. How God brought them back from the brink, essentially, even to the point where they were going to be massacred en masse in the entire empire of Persia. How God brought them back from literally the moment of destruction to bringing them back to being a nation again, allowing Christ to come through the nation of Israel. So, pretty important. I'm going to say stay tuned. Next week is the beginning of chapter 1. I really hope we can get back in person sometime soon, especially when we're looking at this book, because there's a lot of interesting questions that you guys are going to have. And I wanted to make a point on that as well. When I'm talking about questions, I want you guys to ask whatever you want. The Bible brings up some pretty interesting questions, some pretty difficult questions, and questions about God that are frankly hard to answer. But that's part of my job. My dad always makes the joke that the role of a pastor is to give long answers to short questions. And that's something that I've always had the talent of doing. And I'll be honest too. I will be learning along with you guys. I don't know everything, and I won't pretend like I know everything. So if you ask a question and I don't know the answer, I'll write it down, and then the next week I'll provide you with an answer. I'll ask the people at the Divinity College, or I'll go through my library and stuff like that, because I'm learning along with you guys. This is just as important for me as it is for you. So I hope this gives a little bit of a good framework for the book of Esther. We're going to start looking at chapter 1 next week. Probably make it all the way through. Chapter 1 is pretty straightforward. But yeah, God bless.